Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. I know it was probably a slightly sort of short notice gathering together of people to listen to the great and the good talk about what on earth is coming out of Washington at the moment and the implications that it might have not only for the UK, but the rest of the world. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Allie Renison. I am the Associate Director here at SEC Newgate. In my past life, I was a trade and business advisor to the Business Secretary of State in the UK government. I have an absolutely fantastic lineup here with me. Some people who bring together just decades worth of negotiating experience, political experience, business experience, and experience on sort of customs. So I'm really looking forward to sort of getting into the weeds of some of the details of what not only the lessons that we might draw from some of the past US administrations on what to expect on trade, but where we might also go from here. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking because you're here to hear from everybody else, but I did just want to introduce maybe one by one to do sort of a couple of minutes each, drawing on some of the lessons of the past, looking at how we can kind of navigate the future as well. And I'm going to turn first to Dan Mullaney. Dan, I have known for probably about 10 years, working on various trade agreements. I think originally with TTIP. It's fascinating to kind of work on some of the negotiations between the US and the EU in this respect. But Dan was a former US trade representative, assistant trade representative, looking at particularly Europe, including the UK, has done lots of trade negotiations, leading trade negotiations for the US with Europe and other countries, and is now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council at Washington. So I'm going to pass over to Dan just to perhaps reflect on some of what we've seen before, maybe look at what I know that there was a big trade policy document the White House published and what might have sort of jumped out at him from what we can expect going forward. So Dan, over to you.
Hey, thanks very much, Allie, and thanks for the invitation. Just to be clear, I was a civil servant under many different USTRs, including under Trump 1 and under Biden, and I was head of the trade part of the Trade and Technology Council discussions with the EU. I'd say, a couple of things strike me as we consider where this is all going. One is there's been a remarkable consistency in the objectives sought to be served in the trade policy. And those have to do with pushing back against unfair trade practices, general unfairness, in particular, non-market economy policies and practices that impact US trade, protection of US manufacturing, and of course, goods trade deficits. Those were the guiding principles, the objectives during the first Trump administration. To some degree, they were also guiding principles during the Biden administration, and they're definitely all coming back in full force under this administration. I think the other thing that is very consistent is the turning to tariffs as a tool for achieving all of these objectives, recognizing that tariffs are sort of an imprecise tool, but nevertheless, they are kind of a bit of a tool of choice. So that's consistent. What's a little bit different this time around is that in addition to tariffs being a tool against trade deficits and non-market economy policies and practices and unfair trade practices, they were also now regarded as a revenue source, which was not the case in the first Trump administration. So that's sort of perceived by this team as an additional benefit of having tariffs. One of the things that's different this time around is that although this administration is pretty much picking up from where it left off, including reinstating the 232 tariffs that were imposed in 2018, there are some really significant differences. And one is that, for instance, the Trump administration reimposed those steel and aluminum tariffs. The first time around, they were because of Chinese overcapacity and sort of the knock-on effects in trading partners. You had to have a global tariff, it was said, because of Chinese excess capacity. This time around, this proclamation that came out yesterday talks about individual trading partners around the world as engaging in some form of unfair trade practices or aiding circumvention or inadequate actions to push back against Chinese non-market economy policies and practices. So that's different. It's sort of spreading the wealth in terms of who's at fault beyond China to other trading partners. The other things that's remarkable is that very quickly, of course, off the block, the Trump administration announced tariffs. Mexico, Canada have announced other tariffs, and have immediate recourse to the emergency power of the United States, which is significant because all of the previous invocation of tariffs had to do with some form of unfair trading practice, as either Section 301, unfair trading practice, a response to that, or Section 232, where there was a process and input from stakeholders. The emergency powers don't require any of that, and so you don't have the procedural safeguards or the procedural steps leading into the imposition of tariffs. And you also don't have a linkage to trade issues or unfair trade issues. In the case of Mexico and Canada, it was fentanyl and immigration. So I think those are two very significant differences. This administration is hitting the ground running, and there aren't the same sort of procedural safeguards as were respected in the first Trump administration. I will say, though, that looking at some of the signals being sent and what's set out in the memorandum on the America First trade policy, it's notable that there was a lot of talk about tariffs during the campaign, but the document itself did not impose the tariffs. It said we were going to study tariffs. Of course, certain tariffs quickly followed, but nonetheless, it was not an immediate jump to judgment. The other thing that strikes me is that the America First trade policy document tasked the U.S. Trade Representative's office, the office I worked for when I was in the government for 23 years, with investigating partners with whom it might be appropriate to negotiate a bilateral agreement or a sectoral agreement. So I think there is a bit of a recognition, and I think you see that in the announcement, the proclamation yesterday, that tariffs are a valuable tool. This administration likes the tariffs. They are a bit imprecise. They do have the potential to impose self-harm. And so I think there are a number of signals out there that there may be room for arrangements in lieu of tariffs or partially in lieu of tariffs that could define a way forward for different trading partners. And I think probably if you were going to prioritize them, UK is probably one of the easiest allies to have a trade agreement with, in part because we don't have the trade deficit problem. There's a certain amount of like-mindedness on certain issues. But I also think that even in the case of the EU or other trading partners, there are opportunities to perhaps negotiate arrangements that avoid tariffs. And one final point, I think it is useful that interesting that in the proclamation yesterday, as I said, there was a bit of a catalog of unfair trade practices and complaints against a number of trading partners. In a way, this could provide a menu of items on which to discuss. If the problem triggering triggering tariffs is we need more cooperation on non-market economy policies and practices, well, that's something that we can pursue. If the issue is that there are problems with circumvention or differing views about inward or outward investment, those two are things that can be discussed. So I know I might be accused of looking for the silver lining where that lining is really very thin, but I do think that there are some signals and some history that indicate that there are perhaps ways to enter into arrangements that can avoid at least some of the imposition of these tariffs. And I'll stop there, Allie. Look forward
Thanks,
to
Dan. And I know that it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I guess the net is much wider. Although some of the things that have popped up, which I know we'll come back to, are not entirely unfamiliar around digital services taxes and the way in which kind of the U.S. looks at those in a sort of 301 cases. I'm going to turn now briefly to Ignacio Garcia Bercero. Ignacio, again, is someone who I knew when we were working on US-EU negotiations on TTIP. He was formerly, amongst other things, was the director for trade at the European Commission for the sort of the US, sort of EU neighboring countries, but was also Canada was also the former chief negotiator for the EU trade agreement that was completed with South Korea and India, which I think is still pending. But Ignacio, over to you, and interested to see how you think the Commission is going to be navigating it. We've already seen them respond recently, interestingly taking the step of expressing its regrets on U.S., Canadian, and Chinese, U.S., Canadian, excuse me, Mexican, Chinese, and Canadian tariffs. How the response might be different. And also, I'd be interested to get your perspective on whether you sort of anticipate the Commission might want the UK, which has kept its head down so far, I think, in terms of responding to the steel and aluminium tariffs, with some support in that respect. But Ignacio, over to you.
Hi, Ali, and it's so good to see you again after some time. Well, let me start by saying something that maybe is going to devalue my currency as a speaker on the topic. I think that Trump 2 is fundamentally different to Trump 1. So I don't think that actually drawing on the experience of what we had to do during Trump 1 is necessarily going to provide us a lot of guidance about how to respond to Trump 2. I think what we are seeing at this point in time, in my view, goes well beyond trade. It seems to be a fundamental repositioning of the US position in the global order. The US seems to be determined to undermine the institutions and alliances we took 80 years to build. So I think we actually need to be quite conscious that we are going to be facing 4 years of turbulence, and that we should be able to try to navigate through this turbulence in a manner which creates as little as possible harm. Now, I would suggest that from my point of view, and I'm not talking on behalf of the Commission anymore, I'm just going to give my own sense. From my point of view, I would recommend 3 principles for engagement with this administration. The first one is that I think that the European Union should be ready to do things which are in its own interest to do. So to give you an example, having a conversation with the United States about supplies or LNG, to see how far we can obtain enough guarantees of US supply of LNG to be able to disengage further from imports of LNG from Russia. That would be certainly in the interest of the European Union. It's not simple because actually, as you know, gas prices in the European Union are so much higher than gas prices in the US. I think it's obviously going to depend what kind of guarantees the US can give of a sufficient supply so that this does not result in an even bigger increase of gas to the European Union. But that's a conversation that one should be ready to have because it is profoundly in the interest of the European Union as well as in the interest of the United States. My second principle would be don't do anything that harms others or that further weakens the multilateral system. So to give you again an example, we still do not know what these famous reciprocal tariffs are going to be. But let's assume that what this legislation says is that the United States would apply the tariff of 10% against the European Union because our tariff is higher than the 2.5 for the United States. I think something that we should not do would be to reduce our tariff in a preferential manner vis-a-vis United States. If we were going to do that, we would fundamentally undermining the trading system, and we would just be encouraging others to do likewise. If it actually comes to reducing our tariffs at the MFN level, that's something that can be considered, but certainly not something that would further undermine the trading system. And my third recommendation would, as much as possible, let's work together with other countries which are also going to be impacted by potential US tariffs. Now, I think there's quite a few issues on which one could actually engage with the United States in accordance with those principles. But at this point in time, it's still very, very unclear what it is, the extent to which the United States is ready to undertake that kind of engagement. Now, if it comes actually to the actual imposition of tariffs, I think in my view that the European Union has different tools to respond. My recommendation would be to have a calibrated response, which depends about what is the type of action that you are facing from the United States. If it is a use of Section 232 for protectionist reasons, as we have seen now with steel and aluminium, and who knows, maybe we will see it with other sectors, I think that immediate retaliation under the enforcement regulation, in my view, would be an appropriate and legitimate response. If what we are actually going to be facing is coercive threats of the types that were applied vis-a-vis Canada and Mexico, then I think this is the type of circumstances for which the anti-coercion instrument has been designed, and we should be ready to consider the use of the anti-coercion instruments, where it is threats against the European Union or threats against one of the member states, but it has to be clear circumstances which fall under the definition of coercion. And if you are facing the issues which are much broader, like revenue-raising tariff, or let's see exactly what the reciprocal tariff means, we would really need to understand exactly what it means. Then I would tend to argue the best response would be a case in the WTO, with as many affected countries as possible, knowing that, of course, that we all know that it's quite likely that at the end of the day, the United States would appeal into the void. That would make it possible for us to use the enforcement regulation if that is what we want to do at that point in time. So I think we have different potential instruments to respond, and I think that the response should be really be calibrated depending about what it is that is being threatened or is being done. But obviously, the preference would be, so far as it is possible, to have engagement, as I said, respecting certain principles, which I think should be there as we engage with others. And I will not comment, Ali, on the question of the UK. This is for the UK to decide what it is that they actually want to do. I still think that it will be extremely important that we manage to agree with the UK an ambitious reset. But I mean, it's not for me to advise the UK what they should do.
Ever the diplomat and technocrat, Ignacio. Thank you. Might come back to the UK-EU reset a bit later, and does the UK actually have to choose or not, depending on the area. So I'm just going to pass now to the Honourable David M. Wells, who is a senator for Newfoundland and Labrador in the Canadian Senate, and is also the Vice President for the Canada-Europe Parliamentary Association, and is also the CEO of the International Centre for Trade, Transparency and Monitoring. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, you guys were first in the firing line, so to speak. You may or may not wish to comment on this, but as someone who went to university in Canada, I was quite struck by seeing in Alberta, which is not exactly, well, you know, there's a lot of support for kind of some of President Trump's broader agenda, that there was some booing going on in the at the Calgary Flames game. I thought that was fascinating, but I'm just curious to see about whether you see kind of the reprieve, at least on one set of tariffs, the initial ones that were sort of suspended on Canada and Mexico on the border security deal. Do you see those kind of things holding, and how much you find that this is factoring into the election as well?
So that's a great question. So I don't see the reprieve as I mean, initially we thought it was positive, but because the goalposts change so much with this president, we could be hit tomorrow. Even though he said it's going to be, we won't implement the tariffs until March. The problem that we have is that the Canadian economy is so integrated with the US economy. Over 75% of Canada's exports go to the United States. And the integration, especially in key industries like the automotive, will send raw materials or not finished goods, but primary processed steel and aluminum to the United States, where it'll be made into you know, something in an automobile transmission or an engine or a drivetrain. That will come back to Canada, maybe to be installed in the car. Then the car will be sent to a factory in Ohio or Indiana, where further work will be done, and then it might come back to Canada. So if there are going to be tariffs put each time a Canadian product crosses the border, and of course we're going to do reciprocal tariffs when it comes back to Canada, this is going to damage not just the US economy or the US buying power for the individuals, because things will get more expensive. The tariffs aren't on Canada, the tariffs are on the people who buy the products, and they're, in our case, it's going to be Americans. So the form of economic coercion that the president has put forth, there is some backfiring, and we see that clearly. We're also, as Canadians, we're not surprised at the style of negotiating. We're just surprised that it's us. We've had a number of trade agreements over the years. We've got over $1 trillion US dollars of trade every year. We supply about 25%, 50% of their imported natural gas and oil, and about 25% of their total natural gas and oil, which is processed. It comes from Alberta primarily, as you said, Allie, and it's primarily processed in Galveston and in Oklahoma. So these are going to be impacted significantly. Towns will shut down if it doesn't make sense for us to send our products across the border. The other part that comes into play, which is the remedies or the things that we have to look at, we look at it in a very much a multi-pronged approach. So there are 36 states that have Canada as their primary trading partner, either imports or exports or both. That's a significant chunk of the 50 states in the United States. So we have been in constant contact, even before President Trump came into power. We've been in constant contact with the governors, with the senators, with the members of the House of Representatives, with mayors of towns that are impacted by Canadian goods going into the state, and those state goods coming into Canada. So we're one of our prongs is to ensure that they know the importance of Canada as a responsible trading partner. If the price of Canadian goods goes up, that impacts the state. That impacts the buyers in the state. So we've reached out to senators and governors and mayors and to ensure that there's pressure from within. And the last thing I'll mention on this part is the importance of, and it's all very well to say it when we have over 75% of our goods going into the United States, but diversification of our marketplace. We have trade agreements. We have the CETA trade agreement with the European Union. We have also a trade agreement with the UK that was instituted after Brexit to maintain continuity. We're part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is 10 countries in the Pacific Rim. We have trade agreements with Central American countries, South American countries, with Israel, with South Korea. So we're going to lean into those a little bit more, a lot more, because we have preferential tariffs, and it does diversify our marketplace, which we should have been thinking about long before now.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I know there's been I've seen quite a lot of made in Canada narratives being pushed out as well, but be very interesting to see whether the negotiations that the UK and Canada probably halted, and I know I was sort of in government at the time, on a new updated UK-Canadian free trade agreement might potentially resume. I know Canada was not in the initial list of countries that the government said that it wanted to restart negotiations with, but nothing like news to move things along. Thanks very much, Senator. I'll turn now to Dmitry Grzybenski, who's going to tell me I've totally mashed his name, so apologies, Dmitry. Dmitry is a former Australian trade negotiator at the WTO, is executive director at the Geneva Trade Platform, and is probably, along with a couple of others on this panel, one of the best people I have ever heard try and make the pitch for how you explain trade to the masses, as it were. He's done it. I know you have your book out, Dmitry, but one of the things I was keen again to maybe get your take on is, last time around, Australia managed to get an exemption, at least from the steel and aluminium, depending on your transatlantic preference, tariffs. I've heard the official story, I've heard the unofficial story about why, but I wonder if there's any lessons that you think the UK in particular, as a sort of medium-sized trading partner, might draw from that experience in terms of engaging with Trump, and also where you think the WTO might or might not factor into any of this.
Thanks, Ali, and you only butchered my name the usual amount, so you're well within the margins. There's no need to introduce tariffs, punitive or otherwise, on you for that. I'll try to be brief, and I'll definitely speak to the topic you raised there, Ali, about Australia's experiences. Though I want to be clear, I wasn't on that call, sort of convincing Trump with my love for his golf swing that maybe Australian aluminum is not a threat to U.S. national security after all. But maybe, to begin, big lessons that I think people should take away from what's going on. The first really important one is that As I think Dan pointed out initially, there are very few constraints on the US government right now in terms of what they can do, and it goes significantly beyond even just tariffs. Even in his, whatever you want to call it, Truth Social post announcing the IEPA threats against Canada and Mexico, President Trump floated the possibility of financial sanctions on top of tariffs and even sort of currency transaction threats there. IEPA lets him do that. And if you can classify the situation at the US northern border as an emergency that qualifies by IEPA, there is nothing you could not qualify as that. Honestly, sort of the trade deficit, the US national deficit, the difficulty in buying good European cheese in several European states, anything passes that mark. And then there are very, very few safeguards. So I think, as Dan was saying, the possibility is wide, and the institutional safeguards are few and cannot be relied on. My second point, though, and I think this is kind of the more silver lining bit of this, is that we can already see that, as in Trump 1, the administration likes big announcements, it likes quick wins, it does not like hard work and complexity. And some of the things that it is floating, for example, a reciprocal tariff regime that is somehow calibrated not just to everyone's tariffs, but also to everyone's VAT and tax regime and their subsidies, is an exercise of such staggering complexity that I think, having fired all of the bureaucrats in the US government who have ever had pronouns in their bio, they are going to find unpalatable. And I'm being glib there, but I think we've also seen that when they are given an opportunity to shy away from that hard work and claim a big win, they are tempted by it. Especially, and though I do not think that applies as much to China as it does to everything else, one through line through US policy for the last decade has been a relentless focus on China. And there are very serious people giving that very serious thought in ways in which perhaps there aren't on some of these other issues. The final point before I get to Allie, your direct question, is that something I find myself constantly reminding people when it comes to the US is to remember that pain is not a zero-sum game. The US can unquestionably hurt any economy in a bilateral more than that economy can hurt the US if the two set out. And I think that even extends to the powerhouse in the room, the European Union or China. With that said, if I am an American farmer who finds that they cannot sell their soybeans anymore because, for example, China has stopped buying them, the fact that a Chinese steel producer is also suffering pain does not help me make the payments on my farm. And so Canada, I know, is thinking in these directions. The European Union is definitely thinking in that direction. Just because on paper the US can hurt you more in some objective economic sense than you can hurt them does not make the threat or reality of reciprocal pain ineffective as a political leverage, especially when you design it smartly, as I know, Ignacio, your colleagues have been thinking a lot about, and similarly, the bureaucrats in Canada as well, Senator Wells. So I think that's an important point. On Allie, on your point, I think the Australian exemption really kind of exemplifies the way that the Trump administration works, which is in a lot of ways it is transactional and not tied to the substance. Australian steel and aluminum was never a threat to US interests, but the reason we got exempted probably had a lot more to do with interpersonal arrangements and the things that we offered on that call than they did any objective judgment. We didn't talk him around to that idea. There were other reasons we got that outcome. And I think that pattern is going to repeat itself a lot with countries that aren't China. So I might end it there. Thank you, Allie.
Thanks, Dimitri. Yeah, as I say, I've heard varying. I think the PM at the time has been going around talking about how to negotiate with Trump, and I don't know if it applies in the exact same way, but we'll find out. Passing over to Dr. Anna Jerzewska. Anna is Madam Customs Policy Extraordinaire. Anna and I got to know each other, as with a couple of us did trade before Brexit in terms of knowing each other, but Anna and I got to know through the EU exit saga. She is your absolute one-stop shop on all things customs policy. She's also, like me, someone who was plucked from the outside and sort of seconded into government. Anna on customs, myself on kind of trade policy, but is also the sort of founder, director of Trade and Borders, and is also the reporter for Eurocommerce on customs. And I think, Anna, you're probably going to take us through some of the non-traditional tariff kind of areas that some people have alluded to on kind of the sort of tax element of kind of customs policy. And I know that there was a exemption for China that the US revoked in terms of de minimis, and maybe it'd be helpful just to kind of explain sort of what that looks like, what's happened since then, because I think it's a very good harbinger for the impact of actual and real world trade on sort of supply chains and e-commerce, but also particularly looking at how the net of what might affect the UK might expand beyond just tariffs. So Anna, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Allie. It's a very interesting, it's a very good question. I think for me, and again, I'm looking at all this from a customs perspective, from a more operational perspective. I don't work in the US, I focus on the EU, but some of these problems, some of these challenges are very much similar, or customs works in a very similar way. And I think the minimis and the situation last week is very interesting. It's a very good case study that shows us, in a way, when we talk about these tariffs, when we talk about the impact of these tariffs and how companies can navigate them, I think it shows and demonstrates this administration's perhaps lack of interest in the detail or how things actually work on the ground. And Dimitri was talking about the fact that this administration doesn't necessarily like hard work. But I think, this also shows that they may not be, they want to move quickly and may not be so careful with how things will be implemented and whether or not things are going to work out.
And could I just ask you to maybe explain for the benefits of the audience just
Yes.
what the de minimis sort of exemption was and how it changed? Sorry.
So just to say that, I mean, this is very, we're going to go a little bit kind of into detail and a little bit kind of, I'll bring the discussion down to the kind of operational level, but it's just because it's a very good case study. So de minimis is basically a simplification for goods of low value. In the US, this is $800. So anything below $800, there's a simplification for these goods. These are mainly parcels, and we're talking here B2C, so business to customers, so your Temu parcels, and B2B. So we're not talking about consumer to consumer, we're just talking about business parcels for this particular case. So low value parcels, they are exempt from duty, and they also have simplified procedures. And this is a big issue, not only in the US, but also around the world, just because of the volumes and how quickly this sector is growing, and the numbers are pretty much doubling every year, definitely in the EU, in the US as well, the growth is quite quick. So it is a known problem, and it's something that the US administration has been dealing with, and there's an actual proposal for removal of the minimis, and I'll come back to this in a second. But what happened last week was that when the tariffs on China were implemented, the minimis was removed for goods coming from China. And then a day later, or 2 days later, basically it was in place for less than 48 hours. It was revoked. It was, he had to revoke or amend the executive order. So this basically didn't work. And it's interesting to understand why. So when you bring in something under the de minimis into the US, it's, as I mentioned, it's a simplified procedure. So basically you don't submit a customs declaration. You submit a simplified form, a TAT6 form, which is just a very simple data set. And then in order to be able to collect these tariffs when the de minimis was removed, you actually need to submit a formal customs entry. And that was part of the executive order. You need a formal customs entry. And a customs declaration is basically a data set, it's just a collection of data. The problem was we didn't have that data. No one had the data for the parcels that were coming in. It's not, you know, something that was collected. If you're a post office in the US and you get a parcel from China, you don't have the data on that parcel because the data is with the supplier in China and you didn't ask for that data, so you don't have it. It's not something that you can get overnight. So that was one of the problems, is that we just didn't have the data necessary to do these customs entries. The other problem was that, you know, in order to do a customs entry, you need someone to submit that data. So basically a customs agent. And of course, there's plenty of them in the US, but again, that's not something that's going to happen overnight. Finally, when you're doing something like this, when you're making a big change like this, it's very helpful if you tell people what you're going to do. And by people, I not only mean companies that need to prepare for this, and customs brokers, agents, and so on, but also your own people. And by your own people here, I mean CBP, customs officers and border officers in the US. So what you were able to see when you went on LinkedIn or any other social media on Wednesday were customs lawyers and customs agents in the US messaging each other or posting saying, I've heard this from CBP. What has anyone else heard something different? And there were contradicting information coming from different CBP officers, and quite a lot of confusion. So this was incredibly messy for about a day, and the parcels started to pile up, and it had to be revoked. And now if we look back, if we kind of look at this from the context of an actual proposal for the removal of de minimis that is currently out for comments and consultation from the Biden administration, when the same problems were addressed, but in a very different way, with stakeholder engagement, with consultations, yes, comments from the private sector, it just shows the very kind of this, kind of very chaotic way of implementing changes that was totally predictable that this is not going to work. And it was absolutely not a surprise. So it's all done in a way that's not necessarily mindful of business realities, and it's definitely not business friendly and not supporting, not promoting or not giving time to businesses to adapt to this and to implement this in a successful way. I think I'll pause there, but we can pick it up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's interesting. I remember watching an interview with Elon Musk on Joe Rogan's show shortly before the election, and he was talking about, he was asked the tariff question. And it was interesting. His answer wasn't a sort of repudiation of tariffs, but he talked about the importance of companies needing time, probably including his own, with the supply chains being global, to actually adapt and be able to prepare for kind of some of the changes. I'm not sure we've seen that, but it does seem interesting that on de minimis, we've actually seen a sort of immediate about turn quite quickly when the rubber hit the road, as it were. So lastly, I just wanted to pass to Chris Southworth. Chris is the Secretary General of the International Chambers of Commerce UK. Chris is, I call him my digital trade supremo. He's doing some incredible work over at the ICC to really electronify a lot of sort of trade documents, was quite instrumental in getting some of that legislation passed to try and sort of drive trade facilitation between the UK in terms of trade in other countries. And I think, Chris, I'd be interested to sort of on the one hand hear kind of how your members from a UK angle are looking at this, responding. Are they actually making any changes yet? But also some of maybe your more, if we can be optimistic in the room, optimistic approach to how you see sort of, the response to what's going on, the multilateral system being strengthened, and how sort of trade and regulatory frameworks might respond in due course. But Chris, over to you.
Well, it's great to have the opportunity to come and talk. I mean, I'll try and boil it down to sort of 4 key points, really. We've been pretty outspoken in the last week on all of this. I mean, I think, first of all, we need to recognize that the underlying challenges driving US policy, economic imbalances, inequalities, stagnating standards of living, high costs of living, we have the same problem, and so do many other countries. There's no need to go to battle with each other when we need to actually really focus on the core root issues, which are challenging. And by the way, almost none of that's got anything to do with trade. That's more about national economic policy, wealth distribution, and so on. But we share those, and we have great empathy with the challenge. We have the same pressures, political pressures. I think the second point is Trump is walking into a different world. So right now he's, pushing out and doing what we knew he would be doing. Let's not pretend that's uncertain. The only difference is a point made earlier on is we don't know what he's doing from one day to the next, and that's really unsettling for business. It's the worst possible environment for business because they never thrive. No businesses thrive in an unpredictable, uncertain environment where you just simply can't plan. 1 minute you've set your budget, you've bought a shipment from some other part of the world, and before you know it, 3 weeks later, you're now paying 25% more for that shipment, which you didn't budget for, and then you're having to pass that on to your buyers or your consumers. That has real issues, and I'll come to that in a second. So the world has changed. It's reorganized. There are different power brokers and players. BRICS Plus is bigger than G7. The G77 is much bigger than BRICS Plus. They are changing world policy, whether it's UN global tax or other areas of trade. And it'll be very interesting to see how the rest of the world reacts. And then the group, which is actually Canada's in this group, is the Ottawa Group, which, as we call it, is the mid-tier economies who have been extremely active in the last 4 to 5 years, really bridging dialogue, trying to figure out pragmatic solutions to keep the wheels on the bus of trade. And that is likely to intensify. And that's good news for the rest of the world. But it's what the rest are doing is what I'm really, really watching. Tariffs are bad for business. They help no one. Let's be really clear about that. The poorest get hit the hardest, and so do the smallest companies because they feel the cost the most. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the tolerance level of Trump's supporter base will be. On a practical level, you set out to buy a car for $20,000. If that's an imported car, you're likely to now be paying $25,000, which is a significant difference. So how long people will tolerate that kind of cost hike when they're already struggling at the bottom end with cost of living will be very interesting to watch, I think. From our perspective, last point, we're just being very practical. We're not in here to go to battle. The other important point around this is indiscriminatory. This is allies. This is the UK. Canada obviously gets hit the hardest, but massive empathy. Canada, Mexico, UAE, Brazil, Japan, South Korea, ourselves, Europe. We're allies. And so it's completely unnecessary in our view. There's lots of pragmatic solutions out there that will actually drive real world trade. Yes, we'd like to do a deal with the US, but please, let's not do an FTA. Been there twice. We've wasted 10 years. There's good reasons why it failed twice. Let's be more creative. We're a big investment partnership with the US. We should be going for something much more agile, like a digital economy agreement or a financial services and investment agreement, where we'll make a much bigger difference in the global economy as much as our own economies. Absolutely, EU reset, biggest trade partner on the doorstep. We must reset that relationship from the UK perspective. And then as Ali, you said, trade modernization, there's a 10 trillion opportunity out there, plus another 2.7 trillion to solve the trade finance gap. The US has a big role to play. So that one of the points I've been making is we need to play to Trump's business acumen, because actually this plays in his favor, because we do need to go at the regulatory frameworks. They are over-regulating trade finance. We can unlock a lot more money to drive growth for small companies, and we can do that with the US as friends, as allies, and colleagues with other members of other parts of the world. So, we're trying to be pragmatic. We don't want to have a tariff war. We will always have to balance, I think, between US, EU. It's not about choices, in my view. It can't be about choices. We have to be in the middle somewhere because we've got to trade with everybody. But we want a peaceful trading environment out there, and definitely keen to cooperate and work with the world.
Thanks, Chris. I'll pass over to Dan for maybe a quick sort of response. Dan, I'll try not to probe you on agriculture because one of the things that obviously in terms of a US-UK, and I know you've been writing about this recently, a US-UK trade deal, if it was a full fat trade deal as revived, would include is agriculture. And I'm not sure if we're ready here for those kind of wranglings, but I'll let you kind of respond more widely first.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think the comments that animated and Senator Wells and Dimitri as well about some of the complications about what's being done and the impact on business and maybe some of the unforeseen things like having to do a quick reversal on de minimis. I think the overall context is U.S. transitions are messy and slow. And so we should keep in mind that we have some new secretaries of Treasury, Commerce. We don't have any politicals below that level. We don't even have a U.S. trade representative yet, which is the agency that coordinates trade policy. So I think essentially at this point, before, say, a U.S. trade representative is in position and before his deputies are in position and similar political posts in Treasury and Commerce, it's going to be very messy, and there is not going to be much of a normal interagency process that results in reasoned decision-making, which I think is some of the things that Anna was saying about how there really is a lot of confusion. Well, there's confusion because there's really nobody political in place to make those decisions yet, except at the very highest level. So I think maybe it's some reason, I don't know, to be optimistic, but at least be patient, because until there is a team in place, including a U.S. trade representative, deputy USTRs, other positions, and therefore some reflective interagency processes in place, things are going to be very messy, because this is a team that moves quickly and breaks things. But I think down the road, when there's a team in place and there is more of a process, I think some of the really important factors that Senator Wells mentioned, as well as you, Anna, and Dimitri, I think those will be more taken into account going forward than what we've seen in the last, 23 days. U.S. transitions just take a long time, and they're moving quickly before all the machinery is in place.
Well, I know a lot of competence over trade policy seems to have been transferred over the last 40 years back to the president in a number of areas from Congress. It'll be interesting to see what Congress wants to do. I could imagine de minimis being one of them, but in tandem with or to stop ? Not so sure the president. Ignacio, I might come to you on the age-old triangulation question. So, I mean, obviously, like, our prime minister here has been very focused on talking about we're not choosing. You heard it from Chris as well. We don't have to choose in these areas. Agriculture, given on what the UK wants to do with the EU, I'm not so sure. But keen for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, happy to talk about that, Ali. Let me start by saying that I would very much agree with the comment that Chris has just made. If I can be very frank, I find it very difficult to imagine how the UK can do at the same time a classical free trade agreement with the US and to do a reset with the European Union. I just simply don't see how that could actually happen. I also tend to think that there are areas where the UK and the US can engage positively that would not interfere with the reset, services, digital trade, AI. Maybe that's the reason why the UK decided, somewhat surprisingly, not to join the common statement on AI. I thought that there was probably some reason behind it. But a classical free trade agreement, I think, is very difficult to see how it could be reconciled with what should be done in the reset. Just one little advice that I would give to the UK. Now, obviously, everyone understands that the UK, like everyone, would as much as possible want to be exempted from the application of certain tariffs applied to everyone. I would just think that it would be very, very, very potentially problematic if, in order to do that, the UK begins to emphasize a lot its differences from the European Union. Because it's totally legitimate to treat the European Union differently because of the fact that there happens to be a deficit between the US and the EU on goods. So trying to use that argument to argue that the UK should be treated differently, I think that, in my view, can generate some degree of political irritation. Now, it is a different thing if, for whatever reason, the US takes certain decisions, but if it is something which really appears to become now an argument to deal with the UK differently than with other countries, I think that could well become an issue that would generate some political tensions.
Thank you. I should have said, because I will be sort of wrapping up probably just after the hour, if attendees have any questions, please do leave them in the Q&A box and we'll sort of pick them up. But I maybe wanted to go to sort of Senator Wells. Senator, I mean, it was fascinating to hear you talk about kind of how a near neighbor kind of engages with a close trading partner when in times of trade fraughtness. Maybe we could have used your advice and the lessons of Canada when we were going through EU exit to some extent. But I wanted to pick you up on kind of this point about diversification, because I've seen some kind of arguments that have been made in the Canadian media and sort of political landscape about the need to do this. You alluded to it. I'm just curious about, is this about genuine kind of diversification for the purposes of replacing or sort of supplementing kind of trade? Is it about kind of international relations broadening, or is it kind of a bit of both? Because obviously the UK, there's a contingent that I know that has talked about CANZUK, which is sort of, Canada, basically ex-Commonwealth countries sort of banding together. And I'm just wondering how much you think this can actually do in terms of a substantive response on trade, or is it about the broader kind of international relations framework?
Well, you know what, it is about the broader international relations framework, but it's the perfect intersection of government and business. So business to business, if we have those trade relationships under a trade agreement, then we have preferential treatment on tariffs. But we have to rely on our governments to negotiate those. And that's where we are now. So, Canada is very fortunate in one way because we have so many trade agreements with very many countries around the world, and historical trade agreements as well. But we put all our eggs in one basket because they were our neighbors. Their currency was strong. They were a manufacturing country, and we were a good supplier of raw materials. And it became too easy, and it became too comfortable. And we had trade agreements. We started with NAFTA, then we went to what we call NAFTA 2 or CUSMA. What we hadn't counted on is that those can be torn up at a whim, without a lot of forethought, without a lot of consideration of the ramifications and the unintended consequences, which is what we're seeing now. So we have a trade agreement that was supposed to be up for negotiation in 2026. It's as though it doesn't exist because we have 25% tariff on all our goods except for our energy, which the United States wants. There's 10% on that. And now with steel and aluminum, we've got 25% stacked on the initial 25%. So our free trade agreement, our partnership, our good neighborly relationship is gone. And it's going to take a long time to get back, especially when we do. And I hear it across Canada now. We're going to be reaching out to potential customers in Europe because we have our CETA agreement, the European Union, in South America with our partners down there, and we'll also with our Trans-Pacific Partnership. And something that we hadn't counted on is perhaps reaching back out to China because we had undergone over the last few years a much colder relationship, and there was less trade than we used to have. And maybe that's a door we'll have to knock on again.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I know that the UK's relations with China on trade and investment have become a bit of a political football for the opposition here in the UK, and kind of worrying about how the US might see it. But it's interesting that you think that that's still probably potentially a path worth pursuing for economic gain, at least to some extent.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, we'll knock on all doors and we'll see which one's open.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Dimitri, I wanted to kind of maybe pick up on, two things very quickly because I'm conscious of time. One is, this prospect of will countries, or is there any merit in countries lodging, particularly with the US having kind of effectively exploded the dispute settlement process, the WTO, really kind of lodging kind of cases, for lack of a better word. There will be a retaliatory action, but I'm just wondering where you actually see the WTO coming in terms of trying to, as the EU would probably be very focused on, preserve some kind of vestige of the relevance of the multilateral framework in all this.
In some ways, the WTO is still where it has always been, in the sense that lodging a dispute at the WTO is a part of a broader strategy of diplomatic and economic outreach to try to address a trade concern. Now, the sort of the death of the appellate body, or the murder of the appellate body, depending on how you want to describe it, and the general sense that the US is perhaps not as concerned as it once was, being perceived as a good global multilateral citizen, decreases the extent to the sort of role in the spectrum that a WTO dispute can have. If in the past a win in a WTO dispute would have carried more weight, now it carries less, but it is still a part of that sort of broader full spectrum approach to trying to address something you're concerned about or feel is unfair in international trade. And at the same time, I think it's a comparatively, and I'm using that term advisedly, cost-ineffective way to signal both to other countries and I think to investors that no matter what is happening in Washington, D.C., your country remains committed to the system and to the obligations it has made to its trading partners. And that is a useful signal to send to investors who really don't know where to turn at the moment for any kind of long-term certainty.
Thanks. Anna, I might like you actually, if you're okay, picking up one of the questions in the chat about kind of navigating the responses. I'm very conscious that all of a sudden geopolitics is something that businesses kind of have to pay attention to again, writ large. But just sort of curious about how you sort of are kind of looking at how you sort of engage with companies on navigating some of this, because I guess the point that you were making is it's not just about tariffs anymore. Some of them are threatened, some of them are kind of revoked in terms of the action, but also looking at like the gamut of kind of other areas to be mindful of. I was fascinated to see that, the UK's digital service tax is something that actually, Dan, I don't know if you want to pick this up as well. The digital service tax is something which the UK and other countries has that the US might now, under kind of Trump 2.0, be looking at this and saying, well, actually, we think those are unfair trade barriers. So I guess the net of what companies have to pay attention to in terms of what the US is looking at is suddenly much wider than just traditional sort of tariffs.
Yes, so I'm just checking if I'm not muted. It's not an easy time to run a business. It really isn't for so many reasons. That the thing is that especially with changes happening this quickly, is that that's not very good for businesses from just the speed in terms of just being able to understand what's happening, understand how it's going to impact you, because once a tariff is applied, it actually takes a business a little bit of time to understand what it means to them, because they need to look at their entire supply chain, what are we actually importing, where it's coming from, and so on. So it's very difficult. It's particularly difficult because in the US things are changing so quickly, but that doesn't mean that things are not happening in other parts of the world. We have a lot happening in the UK. We're still implementing some of our post-Brexit checks, so we still have things changing at the border in the UK. In the EU, we're completely revamping our customs legislation. We're also getting rid of de minimis. So we're just in the middle of a conversation of how to do it so it has, so it works well. We are also, we have sustainability and Green Deal. We have now issues with competitiveness because we perhaps over-regulated on some of these things. So it's not like it's just one geographical area, it's everywhere. And it's not just customs, it's not just trade, it's sustainability. All of a sudden, you have to be an expert in so many fields that we're never. It's not the business's day job. One thing I would say, it's difficult to navigate. It's difficult to find good sources of information, especially just because you do want to pay attention to what's being implemented and not the speculations, because there's so much conversation about what might happen, the reciprocal tariffs and so on, all those things that might or might not happen. But as a business, you really want to just know what's being implemented. So I don't have a very good advice other than, yes, you do need as a business to now pay attention to things that were not traditionally part of your day job. Just as we, as trade expert, need to all of a sudden understand much more than we did a couple of years back. The same goes for businesses. It's not easy, and it's not going to be easy in the foreseeable future. It's only going to get more complicated.
Yeah, no, I know that it's my Trump caseload, that's Freudian slip. My trade caseload is certainly piling up by the minute, because obviously there's a keen interest in how the UK is going to respond, engage with the US. There's some who would argue that, the way in which tariffs are levied, might lead to sort of what some call cronyism, but effectively is kind of special pleading by companies for their case, not just to, their own governments, but to other governments as well. Chris, I wondered if you could pick up sort of just following on from what Anna was talking about kind of how you are working with your members, advising your members to kind of navigate some of this, how they're looking at it. And then I might just come really briefly back to perhaps Ignacio. I know we don't have a UK government person officially because they probably wouldn't comment publicly at this stage, but on the kind of the point about kind of basically sort of the anti-dumping response and how that kind of I think the EU is probably, in terms of looking at trade defense responses and its arsenals, in a much stronger place about how it responds to it, and it'd be interesting to see how the UK sort of might follow suit. But Ignacio, if there's anything that you wanted to add after Chris about kind of how the EU has strengthened its trade defense arsenal, please do weigh in as well. I'm going to leave the Canada joining the EU question. I think we've seen enough responses, not just from the politicians, but also from the public about 51st state chat. I don't know if the EU being a sort of a new home for Canada would go down any better, but I'll leave that one. Chris, over to you first.
We're always happy to work with Canada in whatever capacity. Look, ICC internationally has been pretty bullish on all of this because we know full well what the outcomes and impacts of unilateralism are on global trade. We've been here, done it, got the T-shirt before. So, we're standing up loud, and that's from our 45 million companies across the 170 countries that we operate in. In the UK, we're being very outspoken on behalf of ICC as well. We're very pro multilateral cooperation. We are strong believers that dialogue that will get us through. We don't believe that tariffs applied in these sorts of fashions will deliver the kind of outcomes or tackle the problems, as I said earlier, that are actually driving the problems in the first place. But we must work together. It is going to be a disruptive 5 years, that's for sure. But that means let's be stronger in the way we respond. I think it's going to be quite challenging politically, I have to say, to not over-respond. I thought the Chinese reaction was quite interesting. It was measured, and then it lodging disputes in the WTO through the correct means, if you like. Trouble is the US isn't in the dispute mechanism as it stands at the moment, but it's the right type of approach, and I think we have to keep reinforcing those international institutions because they're there for a good reason. And from a business point of view, this stuff really matters. Businesses have got a massive in tray at the moment. They are dealing with a lot of different disruptions across their supply chains, challenges to business, whether it's growth or competitiveness or climate action or whatever. We don't need more disruption. What we need is a period of predictability, calm, and really solutions focused to get rid of the barriers, make life easier for businesses. Then we all win. Jobs, investment, growth, productivity, it's all up for grabs. But we've got to really try and focus governments' minds on that rather than going into battle on things like tariff wars.
Great. That's not even counting the retaliation scope. But thank you very much, Chris. I know you have to sort of dash off, so thanks so very much. Ignacio, I know, and you and I are probably thinking of the exact same colleague who will be looking very closely and has been doing work on this sort of trade defense arsenal of the EU. But I guess sort of the kind of not just circumvention, but also this sort of the anti-dumping, well, does things get sort of moved over to other markets is something that, well, the EU is probably in a fairly good position to deal with. I'm not so sure about the UK at this stage.
Well, I mean, actually, what I think is, two comments, Allie. The first one is that it is clear that as we are facing the difficult times with the US, that doesn't mean that the problem with China are going to become any lesser. I mean, actually, they may become more acute because of the impact of increasing trade restrictions in the United States vis-a-vis Chinese imports that may then be diverted to other markets. So I think we are going to see trade defense action. Anti-dumping, maybe safeguards. I would expect still that the European Union will continue to maintain very much the line that any action that we take vis-a-vis China should be within the rules, that we would not move away from the need to respect the rules also when it comes to China. But it would be robust action in a number of cases. And yes, this might give some questions that the UK may need to look into, depending on the sector, depending on the circumstances of the case. The other point which I wanted to make is about the WTO, because I would very much agree with what Dimitri said before. What the US does is not going to kill the WTO. what could kill the WTO is how other countries react to what the US does. So I think these 4 years ahead of us, I think it's going to be really important that those who still really believe that rules matter for international trade behave accordingly.
Thank you, Dimitri. You talk about Dimitri. Thank you, Ignacio. And Dan, I might just give the sort of last word to you, because I know that one of the things that the UK government, there's a question in the chat about, maybe sort of this is what the president would want to see, is that as a result of all this, even if the tariffs aren't imposed, the businesses are looking about, well, maybe just to kind of deal with the uncertainty, we'll relocate some of our investments into the US. Just wanted to sort of maybe hand the last word over to you to kind of reflect on some of what you heard. And I guess that is what the Department of Commerce would like to see, even if that's not your old home department.
Yeah, thanks, Allie. Yeah, and I think I very much liked what Chris had said about the importance of empathetic dialogue. I mean, there are objectives behind a lot of what seems kind of crazy, and I think a lot of those objectives are probably shared. And some of that has to do with building up your own manufacturing in sensitive sectors in particular, and the EU is doing what it can to encourage that. The US is using different methods to do that maybe are a bit more clumsy or brazen. But I think the importance of having an empathetic dialogue and figuring out if there's some arrangements that can be made that can be win-win, I think is really key. And I think the one other thing I would say is that we often fall in these discussions, not necessarily in this one, into sort of there being a binary choice between, bilateralism or multilateralism, or between, does UK have to choose between the United States and the EU? And I think the whole point of well-designed trade agreements, whether they're sectoral, partial, comprehensive, is that you don't have to make the binary choices. I mean, you can pursue bilateral initiatives that can actually help and support the multilateral system. We're facing new challenges here, and some of the tools that may need to be developed to face some of those challenges, be it climate change, be it non-market economy policies and practices, some of those tools, some of those rules may need to be discussed initially bilaterally. Ultimately they could be reinforced multilaterally. I think similarly, since we touched on the idea of whatever UK might do with the United States or Europe, UK does not have to make a choice between the United States and the EU. I think there's a little bit of sort of pre-Brexit thinking that the choice is you're going to make decisions that kind of effectively put you more in the European Union than outside. But in fact, the rest of the world views things a little bit differently. There's no question of being, in the European Union and aligning with all European Union regulations. And there's no real reason to do that and have to make a binary choice between, say, the European Union and the United States. So I think, a cleverly designed trade agreement, can accomplish both. You can look in both directions. You can integrate with Europe. You can integrate with the EU. We can pursue bilateral deals that help to develop rules that could be promoted multilaterally. And in fact, that is the history of most of the multilateral disciplines. Many of those were devised bilaterally. So I think we shouldn't fall into this either or binary choice trap.
Thanks, Dan. Well, I hope Brussels is listening. And again, as Ignacio suggested, I think it depends on the scope. And I was very interested to see that in the White House's America First trade policy document, it did talk about new sectoral and sort of free trade agreements, which is actually a departure from the previous administration. But we'll see when and how we get to those. Thank you very much, everyone. I am going to pass over now to Mervyn Metcalf from Dean Street Advisors, who's been kind enough to sort of host this webinar with us at SEC Newgate. But just I wanted to say again, thank you to our panelists. Most of them, I think, are on what is now X, but also maybe Blue Sky, I'm not sure, certainly on LinkedIn. And if you really want to kind of see the nuts and bolts of the arguments in real time as the developments are happening, please do give them a follow. But Mervyn, over to you.
Thank you, Ellen. I absolutely echo the comments and thank you to the panelists. To put in context, we first discussed doing this webinar about 3 weeks ago. We were thinking of doing it at the end of March, early April, but then things came forward, so that 23 days is quite resonating. So we thank everyone for making themselves available at such short notice, and hopefully something that's very topical and on message. I'm not sure I've ever sat through a webinar before where the words unsettling, chaotic, and disruptive have been used by quite so many educated and well-informed people. I guess the reality that I take away from this is the political reality, and it's not about substance, it's about quick wins, and hopefully our governments and all our respective governments can win through and get to the art of the deal. The thing I would add is thank you very much to SCC Newgate for organising what is a great lineup. To quote someone, it's not easy to run a business. So if anyone has any views on geopolitical situation, I'd highly recommend giving SCC Newgate a call. Thank you all very much. I hope it was a useful webinar, and hopefully people left more informed than before.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.